The emergency room doors burst open with a thunderous crash that echoed through the sterile corridors of Walter Reed Medical Center. Marcus Rivera looked up from his clipboard, his trained eyes immediately assessing the chaos that had just entered his domain. 3 stretchers rolled in simultaneously, carrying wounded soldiers fresh from the battlefield. The familiar smell of gunpowder and blood filled his nostrils, transporting him back to memories he tried hard to forget. As the head medic on duty, Marcus had seen this scene countless times over the past 2 years since returning from his own deployment. His hands moved with practiced precision, directing the incoming medical team with the same efficiency that had saved dozens of lives during his time as a Navy SEAL medic in Afghanistan. The muscle memory kicked in automatically. Assess, prioritize, act. These were the principles that had kept him alive in the field and now guided him through the controlled chaos of the emergency room. The first stretcher carried a young Marine with shrapnel wounds to his legs. Marcus quickly examined the injuries, noting the tourniquets that had been expertly applied in the field. The second patient was unconscious, suffering from a severe concussion and possible internal bleeding. But it was the third stretcher that made Marcus freeze in place, his breath catching in his throat as if someone had punched him in the stomach. She was conscious but pale, her face contorted in pain as she gripped the rails of the stretcher. Blood soaked through her desert camouflage uniform, spreading across her left shoulder and down her arm. Her dark hair was matted with sweat and dirt, and her brown eyes darted around the room with the hypervigilance that Marcus recognized in every combat veteran. She was trying to stay alert, trying to maintain control even as her body betrayed her with pain and blood loss. Marcus found himself unable to move, his feet rooted to the hospital floor as if cement had been poured around his boots. His heart hammered against his ribcage with such force that he was certain everyone in the room could hear it. The sounds of the emergency room faded into a distant hum as his vision tunneled, focusing solely on the small patch of fabric visible on her uniform sleeve. There, barely visible beneath the blood and grime, was an emblem that he had spent years trying to forget. The distinctive insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment gleamed through the dirt, a black and yellow scroll with wings that he had once worn with pride. But it was not just any Ranger insignia. This was the specific unit patch of Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, the same unit where Marcus had served before joining the SEALs, the same unit where his younger sister Elena had been stationed. The memories crashed over him like a tsunami. Elena's excited phone call when she had been accepted into Ranger School, her determination to prove herself in a male-dominated field, the last conversation they had shared before his deployment, where she had promised to stay safe and write him letters. The official notification that had reached him 3 months into his mission: Sergeant Elena Rivera, killed in action during a convoy ambush in Kandahar province. Marcus had never seen his sister's body. He had been deep in enemy territory when she died, unable to return for her funeral. The grief had eaten at him like acid, consuming his focus and nearly getting his entire SEAL team killed during a nighttime raid. His commanding officer had eventually ordered him to undergo counseling, but Marcus had buried his pain so deep that even the therapist couldn't reach it. Now, staring at this wounded soldier who wore his sister's unit patch, Marcus felt all of that suppressed anguish rising to the surface. His hands began to tremble, and he had to grip the edge of a nearby medical cart to steady himself. The woman on the stretcher looked to be about Elena's age, with similar features and the same fierce determination in her eyes that his sister had possessed. The other medical staff rushed around him, treating the incoming patients with professional efficiency. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, noticed Marcus standing motionless and called out to him. Her voice sounded distant and muffled, as if she were speaking through water. Marcus tried to respond, tried to snap back into his professional mode, but his vocal cords seemed to have stopped working. The wounded ranger turned her head slightly and made eye contact with him. In that moment, Marcus saw something that made his knees nearly buckle. It was not just pain in her eyes, but a deep, haunting sadness that mirrored his own. She looked at him with a mixture of recognition and confusion, as if she knew him from somewhere but could not quite place where. Dr. Chen appeared at Marcus's side, her hand touching his arm with concern. She had worked with him long enough to know that nothing usually rattled the former SEAL. She had seen him remain calm during mass casualty events, had watched him save lives under impossible pressure. But now he stood frozen, his face pale and his breathing shallow. The wounded soldier continued to watch him, her lips moving as if she were trying to say something. Marcus leaned closer, straining to hear her whispered words over the noise of the emergency room. What she said next would change everything he thought he knew about his sister's death and force him to confront the guilt that had been destroying him from the inside for the past 2 years. "Elena," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible above the chaos of the emergency room. "You're Elena's brother, aren't you?" Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet. How could this stranger know about Elena? How could she possibly connect him to his deceased sister? His mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made sense. He had never met this woman before, he was certain of it. Yet she spoke his sister's name with such familiarity that it sent chills down his spine. Dr. Chen stepped between Marcus and the stretcher, her professional instincts taking over. She began examining the wounded soldier's injuries while firing off rapid orders to the nursing staff. The bullet had entered through the woman's left shoulder, creating significant damage to the surrounding tissue. There was considerable blood loss, and Dr. Chen's expression grew more serious as she assessed the extent of the trauma. Marcus forced himself to move, to function despite the emotional earthquake that had just shattered his composure. Years of military training kicked in, overriding his personal turmoil. He assisted Dr. Chen with the examination, his hands steady despite the storm raging inside his heart. The patient needed immediate surgery to repair the damaged blood vessels and remove bullet fragments that had scattered throughout her shoulder. As they prepared to move her to the operating room, the woman grabbed Marcus's wrist with surprising strength. Her grip was firm despite her weakened condition, and her eyes locked onto his with desperate intensity. She pulled him closer, close enough that he could smell the dust and cordite that clung to her uniform, the same smells that had followed him home from his own deployment. "She saved my life," the woman whispered, her words coming out in short gasps between waves of pain. "Elena saved my life, but I couldn't save hers. I've been carrying this guilt for 2 years, wondering if I would ever find you. I was there when she died, Marcus. I was right there beside her." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. This woman had been with Elena during her final moments. She had witnessed his sister's death, had shared those last precious seconds that Marcus would give anything to have experienced himself. Questions flooded his mind, each one more urgent than the last. What had Elena's final words been? Had she suffered? Had she been afraid? Had she asked for him? Dr. Chen noticed the intense conversation taking place and gently but firmly interrupted. The patient's blood pressure was dropping, and they needed to get her to surgery immediately. There would be time for talking later after they had saved her life. Marcus reluctantly released the woman's hand, but not before she managed to whisper one more thing that would haunt him for hours to come. "She talked about you constantly," the woman said, her voice growing weaker as the medical team prepared to wheel her away. "She was so proud of her big brother, the Navy SEAL who could fix anything. She carried your picture in her helmet every single day." As the stretcher disappeared through the operating room doors, Marcus stood alone in the suddenly quiet emergency room. The other patients had been stabilized and moved to various departments, leaving him with nothing but his thoughts and the echo of the stranger's words. Dr. Chen approached him with concern etched across her face, recognizing the signs of emotional trauma that she had seen in countless veterans. Marcus walked to the nearest restroom and locked the door behind him. For the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to truly grieve for his sister. The tears came in violent waves, years of suppressed emotion pouring out of him like water through a broken dam. He had been so focused on his anger, so consumed by his guilt over not being there to protect Elena, that he had never properly mourned her loss. The image of Elena carrying his picture in her helmet broke something inside him that had been holding back the flood of memories. He remembered teaching her to throw a curveball in their backyard when she was 12. He remembered her graduation from basic training, how proud she had looked in her uniform. He remembered their last phone call when she had made him promise to come home safely so they could go fishing together like they used to when they were kids. Dr. Chen waited outside the restroom, giving Marcus the time he needed while keeping an eye on him with professional concern. She had seen enough combat veterans to recognize the signs of unresolved trauma. When Marcus finally emerged, his eyes were red but clearer than they had been in months. He looked like a man who had finally begun to confront his demons. The surgery would take several hours, Dr. Chen informed him. The bullet had caused significant damage, but the patient was young and strong. Her chances of survival were good, though there might be lasting effects on her mobility depending on nerve damage. Marcus nodded, absorbing the medical information while his mind remained focused on the personal revelation that had shaken him to his core. He made his way to the hospital chapel, a small, quiet space where many families waited during their darkest hours. The room was empty except for a few wooden pews and a simple altar adorned with flowers. Marcus had never been particularly religious, but something about the peaceful atmosphere drew him in. He sat in the back row and tried to process everything that had just happened. This mysterious woman knew things about Elena's death that no one had ever told him. The official reports had been clinical and sparse, providing only the basic facts about the convoy ambush. He had never learned the personal details, the human moments that had occurred during his sister's final hour. Now suddenly those missing pieces were within his reach, carried in the memories of a wounded stranger who had shared Elena's last battle. 4 hours passed before Dr. Chen emerged from the operating room, her surgical scrub stained with blood but her expression cautiously optimistic. Marcus had spent the entire time pacing the waiting area, his military bearing intact but his eyes betraying the emotional turmoil churning beneath the surface. He had called in a replacement for his shift, something he had never done in his 2 years at Walter Reed. The surgery had been successful, Dr. Chen reported. They had managed to repair the damaged blood vessels and remove most of the bullet fragments from the woman's shoulder. There would be extensive physical therapy ahead and some permanent loss of mobility was likely, but she would live. More importantly for Marcus, she would be conscious within the next few hours and able to answer the questions that had been burning inside him since their brief encounter in the emergency room. Marcus volunteered to monitor her recovery, a request that Dr. Chen granted with some hesitation. She had noticed the intense personal connection between Marcus and the patient, and while she understood the need for closure among veterans, she also worried about the emotional toll it might take on her colleague. She made Marcus promise to call for backup if he felt overwhelmed by whatever revelations awaited him. The patient had been moved to a private room in the intensive care unit, surrounded by monitors that tracked her vital signs with steady electronic beeps. Marcus pulled a chair next to her bed and settled in for what might be a long wait. Her face looked peaceful in sleep, younger somehow without the pain and urgency that had marked their first meeting. An IV drip fed antibiotics and pain medication into her system, while her body began the slow process of healing. As Marcus watched her sleep, he found himself searching her features for any resemblance to Elena. They were both Latina women of similar age and build, but their facial structures were quite different. This woman had sharper cheekbones and a more angular jaw, while Elena had possessed softer, more rounded features inherited from their mother's side of the family. Yet something about her presence reminded him strongly of his sister, perhaps the same determination that seemed to radiate from her even in unconsciousness. Hospital policy required Marcus to inform the patient's family of her condition, but her emergency contact information had been destroyed, along with most of her personal belongings during the attack that had wounded her. Her dog tags provided only basic information: Staff Sergeant Isabella Santos, blood type O-negative Catholic. The lack of personal details made Marcus realize how little he actually knew about this woman, who claimed to have shared his sister's final moments. As evening approached, Isabella began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered open slowly, and she winced as consciousness brought back the awareness of her injuries. Marcus leaned forward, offering her a cup of ice chips that she accepted gratefully. Her throat was dry from the anesthesia, and it took several minutes before she could speak clearly. "You stayed," she said, her voice hoarse but stronger than it had been in the emergency room. "I wasn't sure if I had dreamed our conversation or if it had really happened. Sometimes the pain medication makes everything feel surreal." Marcus assured her that their earlier exchange had been real, and that he had been waiting to hear more about Elena's final mission. Isabella nodded slowly, seeming to gather her strength for what she knew would be a difficult conversation. She asked Marcus to help her sit up slightly, wanting to look him in the eye as she shared the story she had been carrying for 2 long years. Isabella began by explaining how she had come to know Elena. They had been assigned to the same squad in Bravo Company, arriving in Afghanistan within weeks of each other. Both were among the few women in their unit, which had created an immediate bond between them. Elena had taken Isabella under her wing, helping her navigate the challenges of being female soldiers in a combat zone where gender barriers were slowly being broken down. The two women had become close friends, sharing stories about their families during the long hours of guard duty. Elena had spoken frequently about her brother Marcus, the Navy SEAL who had inspired her to join the military. She carried a photo of them together at his graduation from Buddhist training, taken on the day he had earned his trident pin. Elena had been so proud that day, she told Isabella, because Marcus had achieved something that only a few hundred men accomplish each year. Isabella paused in her story, studying Marcus's face as she shared these intimate details about his sister's thoughts and feelings. She could see the pain in his eyes, but also a desperate hunger for any connection to Elena's memory. These small personal details meant more to him than any official commendation or military honor ever could. The convoy mission that had claimed Elena's life had been routine, Isabella continued. They were escorting supplies to a forward operating base in a supposedly secure area. Intelligence reports had indicated minimal threat levels, and the convoy had made the same route dozens of times without incident. Elena had been in good spirits that morning, excited about a care package from home that contained their mother's homemade cookies and a new photo of Marcus from his latest deployment. But intelligence reports in Afghanistan were often wrong, and this mission had been no exception. The convoy had driven straight into a carefully planned ambush orchestrated by insurgents who had been watching the route for weeks. Improvised explosive devices had disabled the lead vehicle, while rocket-propelled grenades had targeted the supply trucks from concealed positions on both sides of the narrow mountain road. Isabella's voice grew quieter as she described the chaos that had erupted around them. The sound of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls, the acrid smell of burning fuel and explosives, the screams of wounded soldiers calling for help. In the midst of this nightmare, Elena had performed exactly as her training had prepared her to do. She had immediately moved to establish a defensive perimeter, while calling for medical assistance for the wounded. Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she continued her account of that devastating day. Marcus reached over and gently squeezed her uninjured hand, offering what comfort he could while steeling himself for the details he had both longed for and dreaded hearing. The steady beeping of the heart monitor provided a rhythmic backdrop to Isabella's words as she transported them both back to that dusty Afghan mountainside. The ambush had been more sophisticated than typical insurgent attacks, Isabella explained. The enemy had positioned themselves with military precision, using the terrain to their advantage while cutting off all escape routes. Elena had immediately recognized the tactical situation and began coordinating the defense of their position. She had moved from soldier to soldier, checking on wounded comrades and redistributing ammunition while bullets whined overhead. Marcus listened intently as Isabella described his sister's actions during those crucial first minutes of the firefight. Elena had dragged two wounded soldiers to safety behind an overturned Humvee, using her own body as a shield, while applying pressure bandages to their injuries. She had then established radio contact with their forward operating base, calling in their position and requesting immediate air support and medical evacuation. She was fearless, Isabella said, her voice filled with admiration and sorrow. I had seen Elena in training exercises and smaller skirmishes, but nothing like this. She moved through that chaos like she was born for it, completely focused on keeping everyone alive. She never showed a moment of panic or hesitation, even when the situation looked hopeless. The insurgents had concentrated their fire on the convoy's communication equipment, recognizing that cutting off the soldiers' ability to call for help would make them easier targets. Elena had realized this and made the dangerous decision to move to a more exposed position, where she could maintain radio contact with headquarters. Isabella had volunteered to go with her, but Elena had ordered her to stay with the wounded soldiers. That decision had saved Isabella's life, though it had haunted her ever since. Elena had successfully reached the secondary radio position and managed to confirm their coordinates with the incoming helicopter gunships. Air support had arrived within 15 minutes, but those quarter hour had felt like an eternity as the small group of soldiers fought desperately to hold their ground against overwhelming odds. Marcus found himself holding his breath as Isabella approached the moment of Elena's death. His sister had been alive and fighting effectively just minutes before the end. She had been a hero, saving lives and maintaining tactical coordination under impossible circumstances. The knowledge brought him both pride and an even deeper sense of loss. Elena had died as she had lived, putting others before herself. The fatal shot had come from a sniper positioned high on the canyon wall, Isabella continued. Elena had been moving between cover positions when the bullet found her. It had been a perfect shot, aimed by someone with considerable skill and patience. Elena had fallen instantly, her hand still gripping the radio handset as she tried to maintain communication with the approaching helicopters. Isabella had immediately rushed to Elena's side, abandoning her own cover to reach her fallen friend. Elena had still been conscious, though barely, when Isabella reached her. Blood was spreading across her uniform, but her eyes remained alert and focused. She had grabbed Isabella's hand with surprising strength and spoken her final words with crystal clarity. "Tell Marcus," Elena had whispered, her voice growing weaker with each word. "Tell him I kept my promise. Tell him I stayed strong like he taught me. And tell him not to blame himself for not being here. This was my choice, my mission, my honor." Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as Isabella shared his sister's final message. Elena had been thinking of him in her last moments, trying to spare him the guilt that had been consuming him for 2 years. She had understood him well enough to know that he would blame himself for her death, would torture himself with thoughts of what he could have done differently if he had been there to protect her. Isabella reached into the bedside table and withdrew a small object that had been among her few salvaged personal belongings. It was Elena's dog tag, slightly bent and stained with old blood but still legible. She had been carrying it ever since Elena's death, hoping to find a way to return it to her family. She pressed the metal tag into Marcus's palm, finally completing the mission she had carried for 2 years. Elena had also asked Isabella to tell Marcus about the letters she had written but never sent. There was a box in her footlocker back at base camp, filled with dozens of letters addressed to her brother, letters describing her daily life in Afghanistan, her thoughts about the war, her plans for their reunion, and her deep love and admiration for the man who had inspired her to serve. Isabella had made sure those letters reached their way back to Elena's parents, but she had never known if Marcus had received them. Marcus shook his head slowly. He had never seen any letters from Elena. His parents had been too devastated by her death to go through her personal belongings immediately, and Marcus had been deployed when her effects were returned to the family. By the time he had returned home, his parents had packed everything away, too painful for them to handle. The letters were likely sitting in a storage unit somewhere, waiting to be discovered. The two sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts about Elena's final day. Isabella had carried the burden of survivor's guilt for 2 years, questioning whether she could have done something different to save her friend's life. Marcus had carried his own version of the same guilt, torturing himself with the belief that Elena would still be alive if he had been there to protect her. Isabella broke the silence by describing the helicopter evacuation that had followed Elena's death. The gunships had eliminated the insurgent positions within minutes of their arrival, but the damage had already been done. 3 soldiers had died in the ambush, with Elena being the last to fall. The medical evacuation had been swift and professional, but it had come too late for those who had paid the ultimate price. She died a hero. "Marcus," Isabella said, her voice firm despite her obvious exhaustion. The radio contact she maintained allowed the helicopters to target the enemy positions precisely. Her actions during those 15 minutes saved the lives of everyone else in that convoy. Without her leadership and sacrifice, none of us would have made it home. The days that followed Isabella's revelation passed in a blur of emotional processing and practical decisions. Marcus had taken emergency leave from his position at Walter Reed, something his supervisors granted without question once they understood the circumstances. Isabella's recovery progressed steadily, though her shoulder would require months of intensive physical therapy to regain even partial function. Marcus found himself spending every free moment at Isabella's bedside, hungry for every detail she could share about Elena's life in Afghanistan. Isabella proved to be a gifted storyteller, painting vivid pictures of his sister's daily routine, her friendships with other soldiers, and her unwavering determination to prove herself in a challenging environment. Each story was like a precious gift to Marcus, filling in the gaps of Elena's final year that he had missed while deployed. Elena had established herself as a mentor to newer soldiers in the unit, Isabella revealed. Despite being only in her second year of service, Elena had possessed a natural leadership ability that drew others to her. She had organized study groups to help soldiers prepare for promotion exams, led volunteer efforts to improve living conditions at their forward operating base, and served as an unofficial counselor for troops struggling with the psychological demands of combat deployment. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had truly found her calling in military service. Elena had not been simply enduring her deployment, waiting for it to end so she could return home. She had been thriving, making genuine differences in the lives of her fellow soldiers while developing into the kind of leader the Army desperately needed. Her death had not only been a personal tragedy for her family, but a significant loss for everyone who had served with her. Isabella also shared details about Elena's plans for after her deployment. She had been considering applying for officer candidate school, hoping to become a commissioned officer who could lead larger units and have an even greater impact on military operations. Elena had spoken frequently about wanting to follow in Marcus's footsteps by attending advanced training programs that would expand her capabilities and responsibilities. These revelations forced Marcus to confront his own complicated feelings about Elena's military service. He had initially supported her decision to enlist, proud that she shared his commitment to serving their country. But after her death, he had begun to question whether he had influenced her to pursue a path that ultimately led to her destruction. Learning about her happiness and success in the Army helped ease some of that guilt while simultaneously making her loss feel even more profound. Dr. Chen had been monitoring both Marcus and Isabella throughout this period, recognizing that their emotional healing was just as important as Isabella's physical recovery. She had arranged for a military chaplain to visit with them, providing professional support for processing grief and trauma. The chaplain, a veteran himself who had lost close friends in combat, helped both soldiers understand that survivors' guilt was a normal response to traumatic loss. Isabella revealed that she had been struggling with her own career decisions since Elena's death. The shoulder injury would likely end her combat deployment eligibility, forcing her to transition to a different military occupation or consider leaving the service entirely. She had been contemplating these options during her current deployment, when the attack that wounded her had occurred. Marcus found himself in the unexpected position of providing career counseling to Isabella, drawing on his own experience transitioning from active combat roles to medical support positions. He explained how his SEAL training had prepared him for his current work at Walter Reed, allowing him to continue serving veterans even though he was no longer deployed in combat zones. There were many ways to honor Elena's memory while building a meaningful military career. The conversation gradually shifted to Marcus's own future plans. His enlistment was scheduled to end in 18 months, and he had been considering whether to re-enlist or transition to civilian life. Elena's death had left him questioning his motivations for continued service, wondering if he was staying in the military for the right reasons or simply because he did not know how to exist outside the structured world of military life. Isabella pointed out that Marcus's work at Walter Reed was clearly more than just a job for him. She had observed his interactions with other wounded veterans during her stay at the hospital, noting how he connected with patients in ways that purely civilian medical staff could not. His combination of combat experience and medical training made him uniquely qualified to help other veterans process their own trauma and physical injuries. "Elena would be so proud of what you're doing here," Isabella told him during one of their evening conversations. "She used to say that you had a gift for fixing broken things, whether they were mechanical or human. She would love knowing that you're using that gift to help other soldiers heal and find their way back to normal life." The comment sparked a memory in Marcus that he had not thought about in years. As children, he and Elena had often played hospital games where he would be the doctor and she would be his assistant. Elena had always been fascinated by his ability to remain calm during medical emergencies, whether they were treating injured neighborhood pets or providing first aid to friends who had been hurt during playground accidents. Marcus realized that his current career path was not just a random assignment or a convenient way to use his military medical training. It was the fulfillment of a calling that had been developing since childhood, nurtured by his relationship with Elena and refined through his experiences as a combat medic. Elena's death had not derailed his purpose, it had clarified it. That evening, Marcus made the decision to re-enlist for another tour of duty, committing himself to continuing his work at Walter Reed. He also began exploring opportunities to expand his role, perhaps by developing specialized programs for combat veterans dealing with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress. Elena's death could become the foundation for helping other families avoid the kind of prolonged grief that had nearly destroyed him. Isabella smiled when Marcus shared his decision with her the next morning. She had reached her own conclusion during the night, deciding to accept a medical retirement from active duty and pursue a degree in social work. Her experiences in Afghanistan, combined with her own recovery process, had shown her the importance of helping veterans transition successfully back to civilian life. 3 weeks after Isabella's surgery, Marcus accompanied her on the journey to his family home in San Antonio, Texas. Isabella had requested to meet Elena's parents, feeling that her healing process would not be complete until she could share her memories with the people who had loved Elena most. Marcus had been hesitant at first, worried about reopening wounds that his parents had spent 2 years trying to heal. But Isabella's gentle persistence had convinced him. The flight from Washington, D.C. to San Antonio gave them time to discuss how they would approach the conversation with his parents. Marcus's mother, Carmen, had struggled severely with Elena's death, requiring months of counseling and medication to manage her depression. His father, Roberto, had thrown himself into his work as a high school principal, using the demands of his job to avoid confronting his grief. Neither parent had been able to speak easily about Elena since her funeral. Marcus called ahead to prepare his parents for Isabella's visit, explaining briefly that she had served with Elena and wanted to share some memories. He deliberately kept the details vague, knowing that too much information might overwhelm them before they had a chance to meet Isabella in person. Carmen had immediately insisted that Isabella stay in their guest room rather than a hotel, her natural hospitality overriding any anxiety about the emotional weight of the visit. The Rivera family home was a modest 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood, filled with mature oak trees and well-maintained lawns. Elena's childhood bedroom remained exactly as she had left it before shipping out to basic training, complete with her high school cheerleading trophies and photos from family vacations. Carmen had been unable to change anything in the room, finding comfort in the preserved memories even as they caused her pain. Roberto greeted them at the front door, his usually boisterous personality subdued by the significance of the moment. He was a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes that reflected both curiosity and apprehension about what Isabella might tell them. Carmen appeared moments later, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel and offering the warm smile that had always made the Rivera home feel welcoming to Elena's friends. Isabella's first impression of Elena's parents immediately explained many of the personality traits that had made Elena such an exceptional soldier. Roberto's quiet strength and natural leadership were clearly reflected in his daughter's military bearing, while Carmen's nurturing spirit and emotional intelligence had shaped Elena's ability to connect with and support her fellow soldiers. The initial conversation over dinner focused on lighter topics, allowing everyone to become comfortable with each other before addressing the more difficult subjects. Isabella shared stories about her own background, growing up in New Mexico as the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her education. Elena had often reminded Isabella of her own mother, she explained, possessing the same combination of strength and compassion that had shaped both of their lives. Carmen was particularly interested in learning about Elena's living conditions in Afghanistan, wanting to know if her daughter had been comfortable and well-fed during her deployment. Isabella was able to reassure her that Elena had adapted well to military life, making friends easily, and finding ways to create a sense of home, even in the harsh environment of a forward operating base. Elena had often spoken about her mother's cooking, Isabella added, and had shared care packages generously with soldiers who did not receive mail from home. After dinner, the 4 of them moved to the living room where Elena's high school graduation portrait held a place of honor on the mantelpiece. It was here that Isabella began to share the more substantial memories she had carried from Afghanistan. She started with Elena's daily routine, describing how Elena had always been the first soldier awake in the morning and the last to fall asleep at night, constantly checking on the welfare of her squad mates. Roberto listened intently as Isabella described Elena's reputation among the other soldiers. She had been universally respected, not just for her competence and bravery, but for her integrity and kindness. Elena had never used her gender as an excuse to avoid dangerous assignments, but she had also never felt the need to prove herself through reckless behavior. She had found the perfect balance between courage and wisdom that marked the best military leaders. Carmen began to cry softly when Isabella shared Elena's excitement about a care package that had contained their mother's homemade tamales. Elena had organized an impromptu celebration, sharing the food with her entire squad while telling stories about Christmas traditions in the Rivera household. The other soldiers had been fascinated by Elena's descriptions of her family's holiday celebrations, and several had asked Carmen to include them in her prayers. Isabella then began to approach the more difficult part of her story, gently preparing Elena's parents for the details of their daughter's final mission. She emphasized Elena's professionalism and courage during the convoy operation, making it clear that Elena had died while performing her duties exactly as she had been trained to do. There had been no mistakes, no failures of judgment, no preventable errors that had led to the tragic outcome. The account of the ambush was difficult for everyone to hear, but Isabella presented it with the clinical precision of a military briefing while maintaining the emotional sensitivity that the situation required. She described Elena's tactical decision-making during the firefight, her successful coordination with air support, and her selfless actions that had saved the lives of multiple soldiers. Elena had died as a hero, performing exactly the kind of leadership that the Army tried to develop in all of its soldiers. When Isabella reached the moment of Elena's final words, Carmen reached for Roberto's hand and gripped it tightly. Elena's message to Marcus had been clear and deliberate, Isabella explained, spoken with the kind of clarity that comes only in the most important moments of life. Elena had wanted her family to know that she had died without regrets, proud of her service and grateful for the love and support that had shaped her into the person she had become. Roberto asked quietly whether Elena had suffered, a question that every parent of a fallen soldier struggles with. Isabella was able to truthfully reassure him that Elena's injuries had been immediately fatal, sparing her any prolonged pain or awareness of her condition. She had died quickly, surrounded by soldiers who respected and cared for her, in service to principles that she deeply believed in. Carmen then asked the question that Isabella had been both expecting and dreading. Why had Isabella survived when Elena had not? What had made the difference between life and death during those terrible minutes of combat? Isabella explained Elena's decision to move to the exposed radio position, emphasizing that it had been a tactical necessity rather than a reckless choice. Elena had understood the risks but had prioritized the mission and the lives of her fellow soldiers above her own safety. The next morning brought an unexpected discovery that would complete the healing process for the entire Rivera family. Carmen had decided to retrieve the box of Elena's personal effects from storage, finally feeling strong enough to go through her daughter's belongings with Isabella's support. Roberto and Marcus joined them in the garage, where dozens of military boxes had been, carefully labeled and preserved since Elena's funeral. Elena's footlocker contained exactly what Isabella had described, a wooden box filled with letters addressed to Marcus in Elena's distinctive handwriting. There were 43 letters in total, spanning the entire duration of her deployment in Afghanistan. Each envelope was marked with a date and location, creating a chronological record of Elena's thoughts and experiences during her final year of life. Marcus opened the first letter with trembling hands, immediately recognizing his sister's voice in the informal tone and playful humor that had always characterized their relationship. Elena had written about her arrival at the base camp, describing the landscape and climate while making jokes about the quality of military food compared to their mother's cooking. She had been excited about her assignment and eager to prove herself worthy of the training she had received. The letters revealed a side of Elena's deployment that the official reports and Isabella's memories could not capture. Elena had written about her fears and doubts alongside her achievements and growth, creating an honest portrait of a young soldier adapting to the realities of combat service. She had struggled with homesickness during her first few months, missing family gatherings and milestone events that she had always shared with Marcus. But the letters also documented Elena's growing confidence and sense of purpose as she found her place within her unit. She had written enthusiastically about successful missions, describing the satisfaction of helping Afghan civilians and the pride she felt in wearing the Ranger tab that Marcus had inspired her to earn. Elena's writing revealed a young woman who had discovered her calling and was thriving in an environment that challenged her abilities. The middle letters contained detailed descriptions of the friendships Elena had formed with other soldiers, including several stories about Isabella that brought smiles through the tears. Elena had written about Isabella's struggles to adapt to military life and her own efforts to serve as a mentor and guide. The bond between the two women had clearly been genuine and deep, based on mutual respect and shared determination to succeed in their demanding profession. Elena had also written extensively about her plans for the future, dreams that would never be fulfilled but that revealed the depth of her commitment to military service. She had wanted to attend officer candidate school after her deployment, then pursue advanced training that would prepare her for increasing levels of responsibility. Elena had envisioned a career spanning 20 years or more, eventually retiring with the rank and experience necessary to serve as a mentor for the next generation of female soldiers. The later letters showed Elena's growing maturity and leadership skills as she took on greater responsibilities within her unit. She had been selected for several specialized training programs and had received commendations for her performance during challenging missions. Elena had been particularly proud of a successful operation where her squad had rescued a group of civilian contractors from an insurgent attack, an achievement that had earned recognition from senior commanders. The final letters, written just weeks before Elena's death, contained expressions of love and gratitude that reduced the entire family to tears. Elena had written about her plans for her upcoming leave, looking forward to the fishing trip she had promised Marcus and the family celebration Carmen had been planning. She had also expressed her determination to continue serving with honor, knowing that her family supported her choices even though they worried about her safety. One letter contained something that none of them had expected: Elena's instructions for her own memorial service, written with the practical mindset of a soldier who understood the risks of her profession. She had requested that any funeral be a celebration of her life, rather than a mourning of her death, emphasizing the pride she felt in her service and the love she had for her family. Elena had specifically asked that Marcus not blame himself if something happened to her, knowing her brother well enough to anticipate his reaction. Isabella read aloud from several of the letters, sharing Elena's words with the parents who had never heard their daughter's voice since her final phone call home. Elena had written about her admiration for Marcus's courage and skills, her gratitude for the example he had set, and her determination to honor the family name through her own service. She had been proud to be known as Marcus Rivera's sister, but she had also been determined to establish her own reputation based on her individual achievements. The discovery of the letters provided the closure that each family member had needed in different ways. Carmen finally understood that Elena had been genuinely happy during her deployment, finding fulfillment and purpose in her military service, rather than simply enduring a difficult assignment. Roberto learned about Elena's professional growth and the respect she had earned from her fellow soldiers, confirming that she had died while performing at the highest levels of military excellence. For Marcus, the letters provided the forgiveness he had been unable to give himself. Elena's own words made it clear that she had never expected or wanted him to sacrifice his own mission to protect her. She had been proud of his accomplishments and supportive of his career choices, understanding that they both served their country in different but equally important ways. The guilt that had been consuming him for 2 years began to finally release its grip on his heart. Isabella spent 3 more days with the Rivera family, sharing meals and memories while helping them process the emotional impact of Elena's letters. She had fulfilled the promise she had made to her dying friend, ensuring that Elena's family understood the circumstances of her death and the depth of her love for them. The burden of survivor's guilt that Isabella had carried for 2 years was finally beginning to lift. On the day of Isabella's departure, the entire family accompanied her to the airport for a farewell that felt more like a beginning than an ending. Isabella had become an honorary member of the Rivera family, connected to them by shared grief that had transformed into shared healing. She and Marcus had developed a deep friendship based on their mutual love for Elena and their commitment to honoring her memory through their continued service. Marcus returned to Walter, Reed with a renewed sense of purpose and a clear vision for his future. He had decided to develop a specialized program for families of fallen soldiers, helping them process their grief while celebrating the lives and achievements of their loved ones. Elena's story would become the foundation for helping other families find healing and meaning in the midst of devastating loss. Isabella began her transition to civilian life with the Rivera family's full support, pursuing her social work degree while maintaining regular contact with the people who had become her second family. She carried Elena's memory forward not as a burden of guilt, but as an inspiration for service and a reminder of the bonds that connect all those who have served together in harm's way. Elena's sacrifice had not been in vain. Her death had brought together the people she loved most, creating connections that would honor her memory for generations to come. Through Marcus's work at Walter Reed and Isabella's future career helping veterans, Elena's legacy of service and compassion would continue to touch lives and heal wounds long after her own life had ended.